few years ago, I had the privilege of traveling to India. I got to go and tour the Taj Mahal, one of the real wonders of the world. But while I was in India, I also got to see firsthand what widespread extreme poverty looks like. And one of the things I saw as I was traveling around India was small round discs lining the roadways, just pile after pile after pile of them. And I didn't know what they were at first. And then I realized that this was cow dung that was being formed by hand into small discs, set out into the sun to dry, and after they dried, they were stacked up, put in baskets, carried on women's heads back to the home, and that was the source of heating and cooking fuel for most of the people in India. Now this lady and the children that helped form these patties, they don't need the United Nations or you or me to tell them this, but the United Nations actually issued a report that said abundant energy can improve the living standards of billions of people, especially in the developing world. So when I think about what the world needs, this is where I start. I start thinking about how could energy change this lady's life. And poverty around the world affects 1 in 2 people. And I'm not talking about poverty like we might think we know it in this country. I'm talking about extreme poverty where people are living on a couple bucks a day or less. 40% of the world's population still use animal dung or some other waste product to provide the heat for their home and their fuel to cook their food. 1 in 4 people in the world have zero access to electricity. So there's a real need for clean, abundant, safe energy to raise the standard of living around the world to remove poverty. The world also needs a source of water. 1 in 10 people don't have clean water to drink, but if you think about the other things we use water for, to wash our hands, to clean our food, to bathe in, to flush a toilet, the normal sanitation functions that water serves for us, then 1 in 3 people in the world do not have adequate sanitation because they don't have water. And finally, if you're a man in this country, you have a 1 in 2 chance over the course of your lifetime of developing cancer. Now, other demographics have other probabilities, but we all know that cancer is a disease that doesn't really respect borders of countries or genders or other stereotypes of people, and so we are all affected by cancer. And so when I think about the needs of the world, I think about energy and water and a cure for cancer. If these are the problems and these are the needs of the world, well then what's the answer? What is the solution? Thorium is the answer. You didn't see that one coming, did you? Well, what is thorium? Thorium is just another element on the periodic table, just like iron or tin or lead. It's just a little heavier than those things. But it's just a common element. In fact, if we go outside and we were to dig up a cubic meter of dirt, something about the size of this box up here, if we were to dig up that much dirt, what we'd find is that within that much dirt, about 1 part in 100,000 is thorium, and so that's equivalent of about the volume of 3 M&Ms. So in that much dirt, whether it's West Texas dirt or it's dirt from anywhere else on the planet, you'll get about 3 M&Ms worth of thorium out of that. And you might say, that's great for a snack, but what can I do with 3 M&Ms worth of thorium? 3 M&Ms of thorium is enough energy, can produce enough energy to supply all the electricity I ever need in my life. Let me say that again. All the electricity I need for everything I use in my entire lifespan can be produced from 3 M&Ms worth of thorium. If I use that thorium and I produce energy in a liquid fluoride thorium reactor, also called a lifter. And so I'm going to talk to you today about this new type of reactor, this new type of nuclear reactor that's able to provide for us the answers to the world's problems. But before I start talking about lifters, I need to tell you 2 things, and I'm going to ask you to work with me through these 2 things. The first thing I want to tell you is that, yes, this is a nuclear reactor. And so when we think about nuclear power, many of us need to start by rethinking, because we come to this with preconceived notions, with stereotypes. In the same way that stereotypes are dangerous and unfair and not helpful when we think about people, and I would say they're just a lazy way of thinking, I think stereotypes when we think about energy sources are similarly there. So if you have an image in your head from a TV screen or something that maybe you're unfamiliar with, or maybe we're just scared of something we don't understand, whatever it is, I'm going to ask you today to rethink with me nuclear energy. What is nuclear energy? Well, nuclear just means it has to do with the nucleus. The nucleus is just the center of an atom. So if you have this cartoon image from grade school of what an atom looks like, that's good enough for our purposes. The little blob in the middle is the nucleus, and the things flying around the outside are electrons. There's a lot of things wrong about that picture, but it's good enough for our purposes today. And for our purposes today, what I really want to tell you is that the nucleus is where everything that matters is. And so if you have a chemical reaction where you burn wood or coal or oil, if you take hydrogen and oxygen, you combine two atoms and form water, H2O, you release energy. And so we get energy out of changing the electron energy levels. But if we change the nuclear structure of the atom, we can get 1,000,000 times more energy out of it. And so that's 1,000,000 times more energy from the same atom. And that's why nuclear has the potential of producing a lifetime of energy for me out of 3 M&Ms in the palm of my hand, right? And so there's 1,000,000 times more energy there. The other thing I would like to tell you is at this point you might say, we don't need nuclear power because we have renewables. And I'd just like to ask you to think with me about renewables also. Renewables are not the answer, because when we think about an energy source, we need to think about from the production of the power plant, the fuel and the cost of operation, to also to disassembling and disposing of safely at the end. And when you think about the life cycle assessment of different energy sources, what you find is that what some of the things that you might have thought about renewables aren't the complete story. And so you need to look at the whole picture. And so if you evaluate them and ask, is this source of energy cheap and clean and safe and efficient and available? Well, the answer ends up being no, 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 no. For example, we'd love in West Texas for windmills to be the solution. But windmills can't be the solution because the cost of building the windmills, because of the efficiency of them, it takes years to get back out of a windmill the energy it takes to produce the parts and install it and put it in the ground. If you think about the question, is it cheap? If it's not cheap, it really doesn't do this lady in India any good for government subsidies to be required to produce electricity. And if you ask, is it clean? Well, we love to think about solar cells on the roof of my house producing electricity as being a clean source. And it is, unless you go back and ask the question, where was that photocell built? Not in this country. Why? Why are they not built in this country? Do you not know how? No, we know how to do it. But to build photocells is a very toxic process that uses lots of toxic chemicals. And so they're built in other countries, like in China. And so if you happen to be the man that this is his rice farm over the wall from a factory in China that builds photocells, he has, instead of a rice paddy, he has a toxic lake of chemicals that have been dumped over the wall from the making of these photocells. So if you ask this man, is this clean, is this safe? His answer is no, it's making my family sick. And so when you look at different energy sources, you have to look at their complete life cycle. And when you ask questions, are they available? Of course, when the wind stops blowing and when the sun sets, these sources aren't there. So renewables are not the answer. So how is electricity built? Electricity is built whether you're talking about burning wood or coal or oil or concentrated solar power or nuclear power. They all start with a heat source. You have a heat source that produces energy, and then the goal is to turn that heat into electricity. And the steps that we do that is we remove that heat through a primary coolant, usually pressurized water loop, and that energy is transferred to a heat exchanger. At the heat exchanger, that energy is transferred from one fluid to another fluid, a lot of times pressurized water into water that's allowed to perform steam at high pressure. The steam then goes through another pipe into a power conversion system, something like a big turbine that's attached to a generator that we get electricity out of. So you start with heat source, we end up with electricity. And a couple of the things I want to talk to you about is what is the fluid that we use in this primary coolant loop here? And for a liquid fluoride thorium reactor, we use a liquid salt or a liquid fluoride that at high temperatures becomes a molten salt. And so a salt, just like your table salt, sodium chloride, this is similar except it's made with different elements, made with fluoride. And this fluoride salt at room temperature looks like crystals, much like big salt crystals. But if you take that material and you increase the temperature up to something like 500 degrees centigrade, then it becomes a liquid. And it flows, it looks much like water, it's clear much like water, and it has the properties of water. It can absorb huge amounts of energy and move it from the heat source to a heat transfer unit for a power plant. And so this is the fuel, this is the coolant that we use to remove the energy from our lifter. And so where do we put this? We put this inside of a liquid fluoride thorium reactor. And here, we'll start on this picture on the left with this reactor vessel. This is where the fission process occurs. This is where we're changing the structure of the nucleus and we're getting 1,000,000 times more energy out than chemical processes. Energy is released here and it flows through this liquid molten salt over here to a heat exchanger. The energy is transferred to a working fluid, goes through a turbine. The turbine turns, produces electricity. Because we started with the salt that's so hot, there's enough energy left at this stage that we can actually use that energy to desalinate water. So we can start pumping dirty water, maybe salt water from the ocean or from the Gulf, and out comes pure water. And so we end up producing electricity, we end up producing water, but the third thing we produce might be the most important and most exciting of all of them. Back over here in the core, what used to be waste products from a normal nuclear reactor process, we can actually now use to save lives as medical isotopes. Let me tell you how this happens. In a normal pressurized water reactor that uses uranium as a fuel or plutonium, we put that fuel inside of metal sleeves and we call it a solid fuel reactor. And so that fuel is behind a casing of metal or ceramic, and when the fuel breaks apart and makes other things, it's lumped in with all of the waste all together. So you end up with unburnt fuel, waste, and useful things that are just stuck in this environment, and you can't get to them. But because of this reactor design, the fuel is suspended in this molten salt. You can siphon it off, chemically separate out these, what we used to call waste, but are actually medical isotopes, and we can use those to treat and cure cancer. And so we get medical isotopes out of this reactor also. The final feature of this reactor that I want to share with you that's different than anything we currently use is because the fuel is suspended in this molten salt, we can actually have a unique safety feature. At the bottom of this reactor core, there's a pipe that goes down into a drain tank, and in that pipe, there's a slug of this salt that's in a frozen crystal form. And it stays right there unless something goes wrong with the reactor. If something goes wrong with the reactor and the temperature starts to raise for whatever reason, as the temperature in the core gets warmer and warmer, then this plug would melt, and all of the coolant, including the fuel in the reactor, drains down naturally into this drain tank. And so when we talk about liquid fluoride thorium reactors, we actually say that they're what we call walk-away safe. Because if every reactor operator was to walk off the job, if you were to completely lose power, if everyone was to abandon and walk away from an operating reactor, what would happen? In the primary core, the temperature would go up, the frozen plug of salt would melt, gravity would cause it to drain down into drain tanks. It would cool off naturally, passively, become hard crystal salts in kegs at the bottom of the reactor. Nothing released to the environment, nothing to melt down, no hydrogen explosions. In other words, there's no chance of what happened at 3 Mile Island or Fukushima to happen again with a reactor like this. So we have a safe reactor. If you're looking at this picture and you're saying, that looks like an old drawing, you're right. What you're looking at there is a drawing of a reactor that was built 50 years ago. In the 1960s at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, this reactor, this molten salt reactor experiment, was built and operated for 4 years. It used molten salt, it used nuclear fuel suspended in the fluid, and it was used and tested and in working technology in the 1960s. Why are we 50 years later talking about it like it's a new idea worth sharing? Well, unfortunately, in the 60s, the priorities of this country and the world were not, can we make cheap energy, can we provide water, and can we get medical isotopes to treat cancer? The priorities in the 1960s in this country were, how fast can we get a nuclear reactor into a nuclear submarine? And how fast can we produce materials that can be used to make bombs to win the arms race? Unfortunately, you can't make bombs out of the materials from a lifter. And so this technology was mothballed. It's long past time that we as a nation and as a world take this out of the mothballs and use it again. So, what are the key characteristics of a liquid fluoride thorium reactor? I hope you understand how they can be safer than other forms of nuclear power. I also want to tell you that it's the cleanest type of energy you can imagine. If we make all of our electricity out of a liquid fluoride thorium reactor, how much fuel do we use? How much waste do we generate? Well, let's just take, for example, the city of Abilene. If we wanted to power the city of Abilene, produce all the electricity needed for the city of Abilene, 120,000 people, for a year, how much oil would it take? 33 million gallons, give or take. We're talking super tankers full of oil is what's necessary. And when you burn 33 million gallons of oil, you end up producing 1 billion pounds of carbon dioxide that's released in the atmosphere, not to mention other toxics and other environmental damage. If you want to power the city of Abilene with thorium, you can do it all with the thorium you could put in a 1-gallon paint can. This is enough thorium to power the city of Abilene electricity for a year. And then you can ask the question, well, how much waste do we produce? And there's actually 0 carbon dioxide that's produced with the thorium reactor. We don't produce any CO2, so nothing's added to the atmosphere. Well, what about the radioactive waste? Remember, most of this gallon worth of thorium is actually siphoned off and used as medical isotopes to help treat and cure cancer. There is some waste left over. They don't make small enough cans at the store. This is a quart. It's not this much. It's less than a quart of waste would be produced in operating the nuclear power plants for a year. And so the amount of waste that's generated from a thorium plant is really small. You could put it all in this one can and store it away. Cheap, what's the cost of 33 million gallons of oil? Today's reduced oil price, we're looking $45 million. What's the price to operate a thorium plant? The cost to buy the thorium to produce electricity, less than a penny a day. Less than a penny a day is what it would cost me for all the electricity I need. And that's something that everyone can afford. Abundant fuel. Remember I told you, if you went outside and dug up this cubic meter of dirt, you could get 3 M&Ms worth of thorium. Well, thorium is actually 3 times more abundant than tin, and it's found around the globe. And so every country has thorium mines and thorium reserves, so it's something that the whole world has access to. What do we get from lifters? We get clean, cheap, abundant, safe energy and water. And it's clean enough and cheap enough that it can be truly raise the standard of living of people all around the world. We can also siphon off these medical isotopes. Let me tell you briefly about targeted alpha therapy. This is just one type of experimental therapy that doctors are using bismuth-213, one of the isotopes that you can harvest from a lifter. That alpha emitter, doctors describe it as a smart bomb for cancer cells. You attach it to antibodies, the antibodies are ingested, they go to the tumor, and it delivers this radioactive material right to the tumor, and these alpha particles are 1,000 times more effective at killing cancer than normal types of radiation treatments. And so when you look at this example down here, here's a liver tumor before a treatment, after a single treatment with bismuth-213, completely gone. There is no trace of the tumors left. Now, doctors want to do more and more studies with this, but what they found is that there's not a source of bismuth-213 out there because there's not a lifter in operation. And so there's a shortage of medical isotopes. Doctors use medical isotopes 65 million times a year to treat patients, and they would use it more, except there's a shortage of those isotopes. I'd like for you to thank you for thinking with me about thorium. I encourage you to continue to rethink what nuclear energy means to you. And I'm going to just challenge you to think about putting thorium in a liquid fluoride thorium reactor so that we can get the clean energy and the water and the medical isotopes so that we can meet the needs of the world. Building and developing lifters is truly a global service project. Thorium is the answer, and I think that's an idea worth sharing. Thank you.